Hi everyone, I'm Anthony O'Flynn. You may have seen a lot of memes, various info going around social media lately in the claims of asking for a pandemic amnesty. And this is really due to the publication of an article in the Atlantic, which is a magazine that was founded in the 1800s in the US, in Boston actually. And this article has been written by Emily Oster, who unsurprisingly is actually an academic. And in this article, she goes on to denote the various reasons and claims why we should now move on from the events of 2020 and beyond and settle for an amnesty. And I would suggest that anyone who is basically calling for this is like an advocate of a total lack of accountability in what has transpired, the events that have transpired, the abuse of human rights, the abuse of liberties, freedoms, and everything basically that we have taken for granted in countries like here in Australia. And maybe that is the underlying problem, that we, the people, have taken too much for granted. Well, the concept of an amnesty may be justifiable if, in fact, we had seen some accountability. So people rejecting, or at least for myself, rejecting this idea of an amnesty, it's not from any kind of revenge, but it's basically to hold the people accountable for the tyranny that we've seen unfold here in Australia and around the world due to this alleged so-called pandemic. And if there's no accountability, then we're just setting up the future seeds, sowing the future seeds for more abuses of freedom and all the insanity that we've seen taking place over 2.5 years. And it hasn't even ended now, because recently we've seen Kerry Chan making another claim that there's more variants after having something of a makeover. Kez is back and she's making claims of dangerous variants, and again continuing urging people to take the magic potion. So if there was some accountability that we'd seen from the opposition in the political system, the political parties, the parliamentarian accountability, in the police, in the courts, in the media, in the governing bodies, in the various organisations that are around the medical industry, if there'd been some accountability there, then perhaps an amnesty would be justified. But so far we haven't seen any real accountability whatsoever by any of the main players involved, both here in Australia and overseas. And we're still waiting to see what, if any, action will be taken against some of these people. So some of the things that we saw occur, just as a reminder, in 2020 and beyond, here in Australia, were because of a so-called pandemic that had a survival rate of 99.7%, and some people actually claim is actually higher than that, was checkpoints, lockdowns, curfews here in Australia, travel restrictions, that you couldn't travel 5 kilometres from your home, senior citizens dying alone because family members were denied access to visitation rights to visit them in their last moments of death. We saw stories of people who were actually in quarantine, even though they weren't sick, and were unable to actually visit their family when they were dying in their last moments. And border closures, divorce, domestic violence, mental health, increase in suicide, decrease in learning ability by children. Numerous businesses collapsed because of the restrictions. And even now, if you look at the statistics in the surveys in places like CBD in Melbourne, they're forecasting that the economic outlook is exceptionally bleak. It will take at least a decade for the CBD in Melbourne to recover economically because of what's happened. Even apparently overseas tourists, like the backpacker type economy and all those sorts of groups that do part-time jobs here in Australia, didn't want to come back because of Australia's now authoritarian regime, that's how people get treated in Australia. And this will not end. And moving forward is basically holding these politicians accountable, because in this article, Emily Oster actually ironically states, quote, "Let's focus on the future and fix the problems we still need to solve." I couldn't agree more, Emily. And that basically means to restructure our entire democratic process, to uphold the Constitution. We had border closures here in Australia. There were even scenes on days like Father's Day where children with their fathers were like sitting along the border at Gold Coast, in Gold Coast on the border of Queensland and New South Wales, unable to like spend the day as they normally would because of these border closures, which is basically contravening the Constitution itself, and yet no accountability. I mean, it's unbelievable to even think that there's an election here in Victoria this month, and that there's even a remote possibility that Daniel Andrews could be re-elected as Premier in the most locked down city in the world, which is Melbourne. So really, when we think about what's happened, it's not just basically a failing of our institutions, it's also a failure of the people to use their democratic responsibility to hold the government accountable, to speak out, to find their voice. I mean, scenes that I saw personally on the Sunshine Coast when this was occurring. For example, there was a couple who were sitting on the beach on the Sunshine Coast. That's right, sitting on the beach. And there was basically no one within 100 metres, maybe more of them. And then the police came and started talking to them, and they were simply sitting on the beach. And we as a society have completely lost our way if we think that that is an acceptable way to live and an acceptable way to treat anybody simply minding their own business, going about their daily life. And that's not taking into account all the health benefits, because remember, this was supposed to be a health crisis of actually getting outside, enjoying some fresh air in the sun and all these things, which we know are facts. But don't let facts get in the way of a good tyranny. And the most disturbing thing about that experience for me of all was that basically when this happened in that moment, this person who was also walking on the beach that was in proximity to me, because they could see that we were looking at these people sitting on the beach doing the most outrageous act of sitting on the beach, they actually turned to me and said, well, they shouldn't have been doing the wrong thing. And when I hear statements like that, when this events transpire that you see in your personal lives, and I'm sure you're watching this have one too, you know that people have no moral compass. They have no true understanding of right and wrong, and they simply will do anything that the TV tells them, anything that the government tells them, regardless of whether it is for the true benefit of their health or of the greater good and all these sorts of things. And this is why it's been well documented that this mass formation psychosis simply is people following this herd mentality without really considering or contemplating the difference between right and wrong and what the ethical thing to do or not to do in this situation is. So this article goes on to say by Emily Oster, quote, "In the face of so much uncertainty, getting something right had a hefty element of luck." You almost cannot believe that this is an economics lecturer, by the way, an academic, could say, after we've had the mantra, trust the science, follow the science, all these things about the science, and then refers back to that we should basically regard that anyone that got something right, and calling out this insanity and this total crazed mass formation psychosis and some of the policies, it's the greatest failing of public policy in the history of Australia so far, and I'm sure we'll see greater ones until we get some sort of sane government with sane politicians with good values who have some level of integrity, to consider that all the people that spoke out about this right from the start were somehow lucky. It's completely ridiculous, it really is. And basically here we are now recovering from what we've seen with police brutality. I mean, let's not forget that the police in Victoria, they fired rubber bullets on a peaceful crowd at the shrine, and they also fired rubber bullets at children. That's right. We saw all kinds of different events in regard to police brutality. We even saw a pregnant mother who was going to her ultrasound dressed in her pajamas, handcuffed by Victorian police. And so if you think we can just move on as a society here in Australia and forget about what's happened in the last 3 years, then that means that we have learned nothing whatsoever. And that statement that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it is very appropriate for the time we live in. Because to whitewash this, that people were trying to do their best in the various circumstances that they had, and this tactic is completely predictable, that everyone will come up with the defense of, oh, we were doing our best in the circumstances, we were doing our best in the situation. That's ridiculous, because the evidence was everywhere. Even the inventor of the PCR test said that it wasn't a diagnostic tool. And there was no debate on many of these things, regardless of what your own political opinions were. Facts are facts. And this basic experiment is not just an experiment in terms of medical experiment, but also in terms of an experiment of introducing totalitarian way of living into Australia. If we just let this go, then this is just setting up for future generations and for future events, for future pandemics, for future manufactured crises, that basically it's okay to lock people up in their house, to lock people up who are completely healthy, to let the dying die by themselves, to deny access to various families, to meet each other for Christmas, and all the other things we saw, continual abuse by the police, by the government, overstepping their authority, and basically an abuse of office. So there's no question that there needs to be accountability for what's happened here, and there will be accountability in this world and the next for people who have basically abused their office and have been instrumental in this globalist agenda to basically introduce this tyranny. And this has not ended. In fact, we're only now entering a new chapter of it, and this will make the pandemic seem minor compared to what's coming with all the other manufactured crises that are ahead of us in terms of the energy crisis, the global famine that is about to commence, and the economic crisis that's unfolding, the death of the US dollar, the hyperinflation of the US dollar, and all kinds of economic calamities. And we are only at the beginning of this. And because the people have been so compliant, have not stood firm and spoken out against this abuse of office, this abuse of power, we are simply setting up and inviting in the next round of these abuses in different forms with different leaders from different parties, but the same one agenda going forward, because everything is coordinated. And as you should realize by now, the people who are behind this are extremely well insulated. They never ever will be making public statements around this, the real people organising this. They let the fall guys, the puppets, the front men, the politicians, the various medical mafia people and so on to do the dirty work, because they know that all those public statements in the digital age will come back to haunt them, will come back to ensure that people realise and remember that they were instrumental in advocating this tyranny on the public, on the people they actually work for, which is a sick joke, because these people never lost a week's pay. In fact, many of them actually got pay rises during the pandemic and were simply basically profiting off this. And meanwhile, businesses are going broke, people are losing their houses, people are losing their jobs because they just wouldn't succumb to the mandates. And now with the fallout of it, we're now at a stage where we're having kids basically being normalising heart attacks and all kinds of other health issues, autoimmune, blood clots, and of course the phrase "died suddenly" is now becoming headlines and seen in the media and throughout the rhetoric that's been used to describe this phenomenon, which basically we all know what that is due to. So the catastrophic fallout from this is really only just beginning, particularly here in Australia, because we did have a lag in which there was mass take-up of the magic potion, and now we are actually starting to beginning to see the fallout and the damage that is being done to people across this country, and which will only intensify going forward into next year and beyond. So the idea of there being a pandemic amnesty, when there is accountability, when we have good government, when we don't have this medical mafia interfering in our daily life, when people aren't coerced into being experiments, in medical experiments, when the Constitution is restored, when we have politicians with integrity, when we can trust the government. We will never trust the media ever again. They are completely, the legacy media, the credibility of the legacy media is finished permanently from this. And also trust in the judiciary, that there will be justice. And we're a long way from that. So this is basically the effect of this so-called pandemic, is that basically now we are seeing that the corruption in these institutions and these individuals is now becoming exposed, which only paves the way for healing, for a breakdown of these institutions, and a way to rebuild our society based on better values and more accountability and transparent government, good government, all these things which we would like. But unfortunately, while we comply with this insanity, while we don't use our voice, while we don't speak out against this ongoing abuse of power, then it will simply continue. So this is the crisis that we find ourselves in as a society, which will ultimately become obsolete, and we will be moving into the new paradigm. But at this stage, there's still a long way to go before we get there. Thanks for watching. We live in epic times.